Welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. Today is Sunday the 11th of July, and this is the Full Scottish. I'm Andrew Wilson, and today I'm presenting the programme from the Broadcasting Scotland studios in Glasgow. I'll give today's coronavirus update first, and then I will introduce our guests, and then we can have the in-depth discussion on today's main topic of news and current affairs. For the coronavirus update, there were 2,190 new confirmed cases of COVID-19 as at 2 p.m. on Saturday the 10th of July. 3,920,145 people have received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination, and 2,861,110 have received their second dose. 435 people were in hospital with recently confirmed COVID-19, 42 of whom were in intensive care. There have been 7 new reported deaths of people who have tested positive. Since the start of the pandemic, a total of 311,855 people in Scotland have tested positive for COVID-19, and sadly 7,757 people who have tested positive over the course of the pandemic have passed away from the COVID-19 infection. Now, the Full Scottish is a programme where we can reflect more deeply on the news and events, and that is what we're going to do today. Today is the 26th anniversary of the massacre of more than 8,000 men and boys by forces under the direction of Ratko Mladic at Srebrenica during the Balkan conflict. We are lucky enough today to be joined by 2 eminent guests who are particularly qualified to comment and inform us regarding the war, its aftermath, the lessons for us all, and the future for the Balkans and for Europe. Firstly, we are joined from The Hague by Catherine Bomberger. Catherine is Director General of the International Commission on Missing Persons. Since 1998, she has led the development of the ICMP, which today is the world's leading human rights and rule of law organisation dedicated exclusively to helping governments address missing persons issues arising from war, human rights violations, migration, organised crime, natural disasters, and other causes. Before joining the ICMP, Catherine worked for the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the UN, and for the US Senate. Her numerous awards include recognition by the President of France as the Chevalier de la Légion d'Honneur, and she was appointed ICMP Director General in 2004. Catherine, good afternoon. How are you?
Very good, thank you. Pleasure to meet you.
And you too. And secondly, we're lucky enough to be joined today by a great friend of the programme, Adam Boys, OBE. Adam trained as an accountant. However, he decided to leave that world and instead volunteered to help the people affected by the Balkan Wars. Adam volunteered as an aid worker driving lorries for the UK charity Feed the Children, and in doing so began a 20-year relationship with the Balkans. After spells working as a border monitor for the international mission in Montenegro and Serbia, and for former Swedish Prime Minister and peace envoy Carl Bildt, he joined the International Conference in the former Yugoslavia, which was established to account for the more than 40,000 missing persons after the war. He then became the Director of Corporate Services at the Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, and he is now the Chief of Administration at the Special Tribunal for Lebanon at The Hague. Adam, good afternoon. How are you?
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Andrew. Nice to see you.
Great having you both on the programme today. Later in the programme, we hope to be joined by the TV producer and news anchor Ferrer Gotić, who's reporting from Srebrenica today and the commemorations that are taking place there as we speak. But firstly, what we should do perhaps for our viewers today is to reflect a little bit on the background of the events in Srebrenica 26 years ago today, and to bring them up to date with what has developed after the massacre, and as a result of the work of a number of organisations and NGOs and governments in their efforts to address the events and to work in the Balkans. So, Adam, I'll ask you first. Could you give our viewers a brief outline, an introduction to the events of 26 years ago, and what they mean today, and why they're being commemorated today?
Well, thank you, Andrew. I think it was really towards the end of the war that the three enclaves were in eastern Bosnia were holding out against the forces of the Army of the Republika Srpska, and the largest of those was Srebrenica, and it was held. It was what was described as a UN safe area, so there's a very limited Dutch presence in the town. There had been this move towards effectively clearing the area, and the general in charge of the RS Army, General Ratko Mladic, entered the town and really put a lot of pressure on the Dutch soldiers to move out, giving them the assurance that everybody would be treated appropriately. There was no clear guarantee of that, and all the evidence pointed in the other direction. The Dutch soldiers were extremely poorly equipped and very under supported by the United Nations. So it was a real failure on all sides. The army of the Republika Srpska moved in. A lot of the people ended up in a former battery factory at a place called Potachari, just outside the town, and fearing that there was going to be a massacre, a very large group of men and boys left the town and started trying to get to safety in Tuzla. And as we found out later, what happened was there was a whole-scale slaughter. Either the men and boys were put on trucks and buses and taken to places of execution in the area, or they were picked off as they travelled through the lines towards Tuzla. The women and children were taken by bus to the front lines, and they were able to make it across, but the men all disappeared. Now, it's particularly important because, and Catherine can probably talk about this more in detail, but the evidence of the crime took a while to come out. There were clearly indications of primary sites of execution. But what then happened was the Secretary of State at the time, Madeleine Albright, went on television, and actually, because she'd grown up as a refugee in Serbia, she spoke in Serbian and said, "We know what happened." And this was about 3 months later. Heavy earth-moving equipment was used to disinter violently the primary sites and then distribute them in secondary sites around the front lines to try to give the impression that these were conflict-related casualties. So that's the background. Now, why it's so important is that it's been classified as a genocide. That's been found in 2 international court judgments, and the families went very many years without knowing what the fate of their relatives was. They lived often in hope that something would happen, and the denial of the genocide, the denial of what happens, is still incredibly powerful in the Republika Srpska and in other parts of the Balkans, and that's why today is so important. It's about telling the truth. It's about recognizing what happened, and it's about making sure, as far as possible, that it can't happen again.
Adam, thank you. That's a powerful and compelling recounting of the horrific events that took place 26 years ago today, and also a great introduction from you. Thank you to the reasons that we're discussing and remembering those events today, and the lessons that we all have to learn. Catherine, if I can turn to you now, Adam was kind enough to give you a lead in there. But one interesting point jumped out, first of all, and given your background with US politics as well. The involvement of the then US Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, is something that is perhaps forgotten about a little bit. And so just as an introduction, can you talk a little bit for us about the role that Madeleine Albright and her experience, as Adam said, as a refugee herself in Serbia, the role that she played in making sure that the events in Srebrenica were not forgotten?
Well, I think her role, the role of Bill Clinton, the role of Lord Carrington, Cyrus Vance, so many people who had experiences with World War II had a great impact on what eventually happened in the context of the Western Balkans. They understood that having large numbers of missing persons from armed conflict would be an impediment to rebuilding peace and reinstating the rule of law. So I think they all understood this quite clearly. And Madeleine Albright and Cyrus Vance and Bill Clinton, but joined by others in the United Kingdom and Europe, felt very strongly that creating a purpose-specific commission that would address this one issue would be an important way to reinstate the rule of law. It would be an important way to ensure an investment in peace and stability in the region. And ICMP was created in 1996 at a G7 summit following the NATO bombing that took place in 1995, which eventually ended the conflict. But there were large numbers of persons missing. There was a genocide, obviously, which is the only recognized genocide in Europe by the ICTY and the ICJ. So I think they understood that this now constituted a turning point. And the 1990s represented really a historical shift in terms of our global thinking about how to hold governments to account for atrocities committed and holding perpetrators to account. So ensuring that states take responsibility was a concept that was really emerging. So ICMP's mandate, again, coming from those who were, had witnessed World War II, had witnessed the atrocities, had witnessed the failure of states to take responsibility, enshrined within our mandate state responsibility for accounting for missing persons. And those that committed these crimes in Bosnia-Herzegovina and the region, and today in so many parts of the world, are often states or political actors acting on their behalf. And it's understood very clearly now that they must be held to account. So you have the establishment in 1993 of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, its counterpart for Rwanda, the International Criminal Court in 1998, and ICMP in 1996. So there was a historical shift and movement that I think underscored the development of ICMP and what we were able to do with states in the region eventually.
So that's Catherine. Thank you. That's a great introduction as well, and a very useful reflection in bringing people's recollections of events which began to be widely reported 26 years ago. But time has passed since then. However, the point that you're making about us learning the lessons from history and in particular making sure that states and state actors are accountable and take responsibility for their actions, firstly in the context of conflicts, but also now, as you say, for the work for the ICMP in a wider range of contexts, but making sure that states take responsibility for their actions, particularly in terms of the provision of life, is really interesting and really important. And I'm grateful to you that for an introduction for today's programme. Thank you, Catherine. Now, when we opened, I said that I was hoping that we would be joined from Srebrenica by Ika Ferrer Gotić, and I believe that we have her on the line now. So let's see if we can bring Ika in live from Srebrenica. Oh, I think we may just have lost. Oh no.
This is Ika. I'm here. Good afternoon, Scotland.
Yeah. Ika, can you hear me? Good afternoon. Yeah. Ika, we're not getting any sound from your end, unfortunately. We can see pictures, but we're not getting any sound. So we will persevere. It's great to be able to see Ika and to listen to her reporting from the Balkans today on this most important of days. So we will persist with her, and we will see if we can bring her back into the programme to provide us with the most up-to-date news and her own reflections on the commemorations that are taking place there today. But we'll carry on with our two eminently qualified guests who have joined us here, Adam Boys and Katharina Bomberger. Let's see if we can bring them back up on the screen. Adam, I'll come back. I'll come back to you if I may. There we are. Adam, I'll come back to you. We were hearing from Catherine in connection with the lessons from history, and also Catherine made the interesting point about the connection that a number of very senior politicians and diplomats drew from their experience in the events of the Second World War, and how it very quickly it triggered in them a recognition that the events that were being reported and were unfolding in Srebrenica at that time and across the Balkans, but in Srebrenica in particular, were redolent of atrocities committed during the Second World War. Do you think that we are showing signs of being able to continue to learn lessons from history and to put those lessons into effect?
I'm optimistic. I think the danger with just focusing on current events is always to imagine that things are as bad as they can be at this very moment. So we look at, for example, the ongoing conflict in Syria, and we look at the sort of the problems in Iraq, parts of Africa, and we tend to think that it's things are not improving. But genuinely, levels of accountability have increased. Governments are taking responsibility; they're forced to. Increasingly, legislation at international treaty level has come through, including the European Convention on Human Rights and other enabling legislation. And these are vital, and we will see a decrease over time. I think it's a fact that that the number of people that are being killed or going missing in conflict is changing. It's decreasing. However, the flip side is that in other areas, and again, this is something that we were going to be discussing today. It's not simply the people who go missing and die in conflict. There are also people who are moving across borders, either because they're fleeing crises like war, like what happened in Bosnia, or they are migrants looking for better opportunities, possibly as a result of climate change. And those movements are also incredibly concerning, and they don't have necessarily the sort of strong international legal agreements that can prevent or hold government to account for looking after people. But generally speaking, I think that there is a forward movement, and if we can keep these things at the level of a good cooperative international community, then we have a chance to see, I think, real change.
Adam, thank you. That's really helpful. Now, I think we may have come back to Ika again, who's in Srebrenica. Let's try a second time. Let's persist and see if we can bring in Ika Ferrer Gotić, who's in Srebrenica at the moment. There we are. Ika, good afternoon. How are you?
I'm very well. The collective prayer has just begun. It's a little bit warm here in Srebrenica. I hope you can hear me well. The connection is probably going to fail again, but hopefully we can hear each other.
We can hear you perfectly, Ika. Thank you, and we are extremely grateful to you for taking time and joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
So, first of all, Ika, can you perhaps describe the scene in Srebrenica at the moment?
As you can see, the collective prayer, as I just said, has already begun. The remains of 19 victims of genocide will be buried today, alongside other victims that are already buried here at the Memorial Center in Gotić, Srebrenica. So the youngest victim, the remains of the youngest victim, are those from Asmir Osmanovic. He was only 16 when he was murdered trying to flee the horrors of genocide in this eastern Bosnian city of Srebrenica. I'm just going to show you a little bit here behind me where the collective prayer is ongoing at the time, where you can see the oldest victim is Hussein Kurbashic. He was 63 at the time of his death. The remains, when they were murdered, their bodies were dumped in numerous mass graves in Srebrenica and around Srebrenica in the towns in this so-called UN-protected enclave in 1995. Several courts have ruled this massacre to be genocide indeed. The International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia, the ICTY, and the International Court of Justice, they said that they brought two verdicts, which are very important in this case when it comes to Srebrenica genocide. Those are the verdicts in case of Ratko Mladic, the former Serb military leader, and Radovan Karadzic, the former president of what is now the entity of the Republic of Srpska. So the forensic investigators have managed to excavate the remains of the victims and identify by the DNA analysis before they return them to the families. And today we see the remains of the 19 victims, more 19 victims being buried today in the collective memorial service. There are probably more than 1,200 remains of the victims still to be found in order to be buried with dignity and with respect here at the memorial in Srebrenica. 570 mothers have already died looking for their children and never found any remains of their children. So their stories are still to be remembered and their stories are still to be continued here in Bosnia and Herzegovina. One important fact that has to be that we have to remember, that we always have to talk about, is actually the ongoing denial and the glorification of these crimes in Srebrenica, genocide, are still very much alive. The Serbian president, Aleksandar Vučić, denying genocide in Srebrenica. The Serbian Prime Minister, Ana Brnabić, is also denying genocide in Srebrenica. And what is also very interesting, that all of the countries in the region have already adopted the resolution of genocide in Srebrenica, but Serbia and Bosnia and Herzegovina. So the families here, families of the victims and the survivors of the genocide in Srebrenica still have to fight for their rights, when their loved ones that were murdered in such hideous crime that is genocide right here in Srebrenica, and their stories must never be forgotten. And Srebrenica teaches us so many lessons that we have to learn, so it doesn't happen ever again to anybody else in the world. But of course, we said that after the Holocaust, and now we are dealing still with genocide in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the most hideous, most gruesome crime on European soil after the World War II, after the Holocaust. So we are going to collectively through a very difficult time, especially the families of the victims and the survivors of Srebrenica genocide. In a couple of minutes, I will be joined with the people here behind me in order to pay respects to the victims and to the 19 victims, the remains of the 19 victims of genocide Srebrenica. And when I say remains, that can only be one single bone, a piece of a skull, or even the bone of a finger that families are trying to bury today in order for them to have the respectful burial for their loved ones, for their children, their fathers, their brothers, and their grandfathers.
Thank you, Ika. As you say, and I should underline, our thoughts today are very much with those who have already been given a decent burial, those who are being interred today, and also those who have not yet been recovered. And our thoughts are with them and with their families. However, you mentioned when you were giving your introduction to us, General Mladic, and of course, less than a month ago, his final appeal to the tribunal, the International Criminal Tribunal, was refused, and it's now clear that he will spend the rest of his life in prison. Has that affected the mood of the people in Srebrenica? Are they reflecting upon the way in which the tribunal has finally come to a conclusion?
The tribunal has come to a conclusion. Of course, we still have the second degree verdict for Stanisic and Simatovic. If you remember those, the worst pictures that came out of Srebrenica and Trnovo are the 6 Bosniaks being murdered by sniper. They are responsible for giving orders to commit those crimes. Of course, we still have that one verdict, second degree verdict. But when it comes to the former general Ratko Mladic, it is a final verdict. There is no way to appeal, and he will spend the rest of his life in behind bars. Of course, the families in Srebrenica, they find that the justice has been served, but as I mentioned already, the glorification of war criminals is still very much alive. So the feeling of justice has not yet been fulfilled. All around Bosnia and Herzegovina and Serbia, you can see the signs that Ratko Mladic is a war hero, that Ratko Mladic, what he did was indeed right thing to do. And in Serbia, in Belgrade, just yesterday, you had a group of radicals that were in front of the parliament of Serbia seeking justice for war criminals and glorifying them. So that feeling of justice probably will never come, at least not in our lifetime. And the victims of Srebrenica, the survivors, have to go through that every day of their life, dealing with the glorification of war criminals and war crimes, and especially war criminals that are already convicted, that have already been found guilty, even with so many people that have been witnesses in these cases. They are still being prosecuted by groups, radical groups, or even the politicians in our country, but also in our region. The resolution of genocide in Montenegro that was adopted just a couple of weeks ago has brought so many controversy in Bosnia and Herzegovina and in Serbia. And now we can see the disagreement from the Serbian government towards the government of Montenegro as well. So as I already said, the resolutions have been brought in all of the countries in the region, but Serbia and Bosnia and Herzegovina. And for your viewers to know, the presiding member of the presidency of Bosnia and Herzegovina denies genocide and refuses to bring the resolution of genocide in Srebrenica. So the families and the victims and the people can finally just move on. That has been refused, and we probably will not see such resolution being brought in Bosnia and Herzegovina as long as we have Milorad Dodik, who is the presiding member of the presidency of Bosnia and Herzegovina, who is denying the genocide and denying the national be there for a long time.
Of course. Ika, thank you. We're extremely grateful to you on Broadcasting Scotland for you taking some time out of your busy schedule today and for joining us and sharing with us your thoughts and your news and allowing us to participate in some small way in the commemoration and in the events that are taking place in Srebrenica today. As I say, those who already have been interned respectfully, those who are being interned today, and those who are yet to be recovered, our thoughts are with them and their families today. Thank you for joining us from Srebrenica.
Thank you. Thank you, Scotland.
There we go. Some very compelling news and reporting from Ika for us today from Srebrenica. And we'll spend the rest of the programme today reflecting on some of the lessons and the experiences and the way in which Europe, the Balkans, Europe, and the world can continue to develop and to learn, and the reflecting on the difficulties that pursuing justice and truth and reconciliation in conflict zones and elsewhere where there has been significant loss of life, and the implications that there are, especially for Europe in the context of those who are displaced or who move in order to seek refuge or asylum, the lessons that we need to learn and that we ought to learn as a result of, for example, the events in Srebrenica 26 years ago today. So we'll come back to Adam and Catherine, who are staying with us for the rest of the programme, and they should be on screen in a moment. I was going to come to Adam first of all. Adam, having listened to Ika reporting from Srebrenica today at the commemoration and today's internment, what struck you most immediately?
I think one of the things that it's worth pointing up is when Ika talked about the fact that we've got people being buried today, and then we've also got remains being buried for people who are already in the cemetery. One of the most startling statistics is that if you take the average number of DNA tests that were required to identify most victims of war in Bosnia, it usually took between 1 and 1.4 tests to determine identity. The difference with Srebrenica was the way that the bodies were treated in that point where they were taken from the primary execution sites and the mass grave sites. When I say execution, it's a term relating to the style of killing. And then they were put into secondary mass graves. ICMP has found one person's remains in 5 different graves. The average number of DNA tests required so far has been about 7.4 per person. I think that just shows you the scale of the effort to hide the crime, to hide the evidence, to try to muddy the picture, and to imply that this was Second World War related or that these were conflict related.
That's a very good point, Adam. You make, and insofar as there, as you say, there is statistical evidence with regard to the amount of work that was required to identify remains that were found scattered. It reflects also, I think, perhaps, or do you think it reflects on the level of both the level of planning and the brutality of the implementation of that planning that took place to firstly carry out a massacre on this scale, perhaps not under the view of peacekeeping forces, but certainly a very short distance away from peacekeeping forces. So the level of planning to do that, and then the level of planning and the brutality of the implementation to, as you say, to attempt to cover up the massacre of more than 8,000 men and boys.
It's extraordinary. Just the logistical arrangements included involvement of an entire engineering division of the army. It involved the using up all of the buses in the region to take people, either the women and children, to the front lines, or the men and boys to these primary killing sites. And then in the secondary mass graves, and we have extraordinary satellite images of the efforts that went into using heavy earth lift moving equipment. You know, obviously hundreds of men involved in doing this operation. You know, in the initial 11 of July events, it was over a matter of 2 to 3 days, 8,000 people. And then later on in September or October, when they started to move the graves, again, massive amounts of effort being done at night in order to try to cover their tracks. So it was an enormous logistical operation that involved really, you know, an army. That was and that's really what was shown very clearly in the war crimes judgments.
Yes, of course, and thank you, Adam. And Catherine, to bring this a little bit up to date, we heard from Ika that efforts are still ongoing to recover and identify remains. and to treat those remains with respect. And also, from what Adam was telling us, the scale of the planning and the brutality of the implementation of the massacre, it clearly would take time, a great deal of time and effort and technology and persistence to begin to unpick and to undo and to explain and to deal with such an event. So perhaps can you tell us a little bit of what is going on at present to continue to pursue both justice, but also respect for the victims, and to attempt to deal with a little bit of the aftermath and the ongoing repercussions of the events that took place 26 years ago today?
Yeah, no, I would love to. And I think one important thing I want to pick up on too is the denial of what's happened. And I want to return to what Ika was saying about denial in the region and then beyond. I mean, because there's still people that believe Trump won the elections, that Clorox can cure the coronavirus, that the earth is flat. So, going back now 26 years and understanding where we started. I mean, Adam was there from 1996. And earlier in the region, I came to the region for the first time in 1996. ICMP was created in 1996. And what's happened today was not self-evident. I mean, none of us could have predicted that finding the vast majority of the 40,000 people who went missing could ever have happened. I mean, today in the Western Balkans, in the region of the entire conflict zone where 160,000 people died and 40,000 people went missing from the conflict and other human rights abuses, today over 75% of them have been accounted for. That means states did take their responsibility, and almost 90% of the 8,000 or so men and boys that were killed in the Srebrenica Genocide have today been accounted for. So that would never have, and the fact that ICTY was able to hold the bigger fish, so to speak, to account, Ratko Mladic and Gotić and others, also was not self-evident. We began using DNA technology in the context of the former Yugoslavia, harnessing a new technology which was not even being used in court cases very much at that time, and applied it now to mass disappearances and to a genocide. Srebrenica was so complicated, as Adam very eloquently outlined. I mean, the perpetrators, and we noted there was the Army Corps of Engineers, went back to the original mass grave sites, removed the bodies to multiple secondary sites. So the horror of Srebrenica, amongst the many horrors, because it's a long list of horrors, was the bodies were in pieces. They were disarticulated. That you would find one body, let's say, or a body of one person in 14 different locations, 50 kilometers apart from each other. That was the extent to which the perpetrators went to hide the crimes. So being able to find the missing and provide evidence to these new tribunals, to the ICTY and the tribunals, the War Crimes Tribunal that was created in Bosnia-Herzegovina, was something that we were all facing. It was brand new. I mean, I think people don't recognize the evolution of things that had to happen to get to this point. We had to assist the governments in the region, excavate 3,000 mass grave sites. We had to create institutions such as the Missing Persons Institute in Croatia, Commission on Missing Persons, same in Serbia, Montenegro, and in Kosovo, where today these governments form a missing persons group. We had to create central records, which also caused an evolution in how to use databases, which I could talk about more in the context of missing migrants in today's Europe. Using DNA technologies to apply to this, learning how to excavate mass graves to a level where they could be provided to an international court, because we also provided evidence in the Mladic trials and in the Gotić trials. You also have to remember that until 1996, the issue of missing persons was largely dealt with as a humanitarian issue. And I think it's largely because we have this legacy of, this is a humanitarian issue. During armed conflict, warring parties should share information. They should protect people from missing. But the reality is, unfortunately, the ugly reality is protection fails. It's failing in today's Syria. It's failing in many parts of the world. So ensuring state responsibility is a long, long process. That requires building institutions, creating legislation that will protect the rights of families of the missing, using modern technologies to excavate sites to a level where evidence can be provided to courts, using DNA technologies. So this is, a longer term process that all states need to apply, but it's an investment in peace and stability. As your question related to finding the remaining cases, it will be difficult. There's still about 11,000 people missing in the region, of which 1,000 or so are related to Srebrenica. They are obviously in mass graves. They could be single graves, they could be mass graves, but finding them now requires, again, somebody coming forward and providing information, witness information or evidence, because the majority have now been found, and reliable evidence, scientific evidence, was used to provide the identity of these victims, which again goes to my earlier point about denial. This denial now is interesting because states have taken responsibility. You would never have found this many people missing or excavated mass graves to this level had the states not built these institutions, created these central records. But there's a disconnect now between what happened, which has been properly recorded not only by ICMP, but by the states themselves. So they hold a body of knowledge. They know exactly what happened. So that's not the issue. So why is it then that certain politicians, and Ika mentioned them, the president of Serbia, the prime minister of Serbia, one of the members of the presidency, who once upon a time, Gotić said that there was Srebrenica, then he denied it again. So, what causes this disconnect between known facts, where the government itself has these facts because they were involved in these excavations, they know these things. So why is there this disconnect? And I think this just goes to a level of populism, nationalism that is not unique anymore, unfortunately, to Bosnia-Herzegovina. And the efforts by states originally in 1996 and beyond have changed now because Europe has changed, the West has changed. And while I share Adam's optimism about the future and hopefully decreases in violence, populism and nationalism are now, have taken a hold of the West in a way that's very ugly. And I think that can be demonstrated today by the fact that actually the numbers of missing persons cases are on the rise. And the drivers of this are global warming, which has increased migration into Europe. And Europe today has the highest number of dead and missing migrants in the world. And it is doing nothing about it. And, we've talked about it. The Council of Europe has talked about it. The Office of the High Representative from the United Nations have talked about the failure now of Europe on a broader level to deal with non-citizens. I mean, if you're a white European, preferably also a male, you will get a proper investigation if you go missing. But if you're a Somali migrant or a Syrian child who's migrated into Europe, there are 17 children, migrant children that go missing every day in Europe, there is no proper investigation. This is still left to a humanitarian process, which creates an imbalance and really has to be addressed.
Catherine, thank you. And just to follow on a little bit about that, we were hearing about from Ika about the challenges of the families of those who went missing, who were massacred and are now being interred with dignity. And we were hearing that, as you were saying, the rise of populism. Or would it be fair to say the re-emergence of populism in politics in the Balkans? That should be it would be reasonable to say that is an alarm call. We can see the effects of extreme populism and extreme nationalism being interred in Srebrenica today. And thinking that the European institutions and the UN went to some distance to establish the criminal tribunals, and there's been the work of organisations like the ICMP. In the context then of the highest, as you say, the highest number of missing persons, migrants across Europe, do you think it is that today's generation of European politicians are not? It will take something much more severe for them to begin to act again, or is it that they too are in denial?
I think they're in denial. I mean, this is a real test, not just for Europe, also the United States, where, as 5,000 migrant children have been interned in detention centers along the U.S. border with Mexico. So this is a real challenge, and we cannot turn our back on it. If we turn our back on these cases, if we don't apply the same rule of law standards and ensure proper investigations into all cases, regardless of the color of the victim, the religion, the gender, the sexual orientation, regardless of any factor, we undermine our democracy. So this is something we have to very carefully look at. We haven't really, dealt. I mean, Europe and the West has not dealt with such a high number of migrants, especially in the context of Europe since the Balkan War, since World War II. So this is really challenging our democracies at the moment, and we're not dealing with it very well.
Thank you, Catherine. We'll continue that conversation now, we'll expand it a little bit, but perhaps taking the lessons from Srebrenica and the lessons from the Balkans conflict and thinking a little bit more, expanding upon the messages that Catherine has just underlined. We know that the rise of populism across the West, both in North America and in Europe, and across Europe, leads to the othering of a standard populist trope is to blame others, those usually less wealthy or less well off or less understood, as part of the way in which populism operates. And we see at the moment an ongoing political campaign as part of the culture wars that are being pursued by a right-wing Tory government in Westminster, and in particular, one of the particular manifestations of that being the changes in the way in which is the othering of asylum seekers and refugees arriving in the United Kingdom, and the ongoing campaigns that we're seeing from the Tory government to class them to either attempt to reduce or remove their rights as refugees or asylum seekers, and or their determination to process them in a way that denies those rights, and simply to push the problem elsewhere. We're seeing reports this week in the press that without changing the law or the regulations, the Home Office is now immediately, there are reports that the Home Office is now immediately detaining refugees and asylum seekers in immigration removal centres and are attempting to deport them as quickly as possible without there therefore being any possible opportunity for those people to assert their rights as refugees or asylum seekers and to be treated and to be regarded properly. So Adam, if I can come to you for a moment, what do you think? What lessons do you think that we could learn in the United Kingdom as a result of the events of 26 years ago? What lessons do you think we should learn in terms of perhaps resisting or addressing or understanding the populism and the othering and the treatment that we're now seeing for asylum seekers and refugees? Catherine mentioned on the Mexico-US border as well, the same issue. What lessons do you think there are, and what do you think we should do, Adam?
Well, I must say, Andrew, I like the word othering, because one of the ways in which people become inured to the concept of massacre or to wiping out a population is to classify them as being something different. You had in Rwanda the use of the term cockroaches to describe people. You had Biljana Plavšić in Bosnia describing Muslims as being basically junk DNA, and so you have this way of perverting what people are, and I think that what is frightening when it comes to the United Kingdom and to other parts of Europe is this concept that when somebody flees a conflict, they are a refugee. Usually when they arrive on our shores, they're described as a migrant, regardless of what they've come from. And by doing what we're doing, people will die. The figures that Catherine described of the number of migrants that have gone missing in the Mediterranean, that is larger than the number of people that died in Srebrenica. So we are, it may not be a deliberate targeting of people that forms a genocide, but by creating this hysterical notion about these really frankly tiny numbers of people that are coming to the UK, rather than sort of finding a way to humanely address that or look at development opportunities in the countries where they're coming, or stopping wars, when it comes to Syria, we're just building a wall, and that it's frightening, because I don't think it's what the people of these islands are. I don't believe that is what they would. They're, people in these islands are generous, warm-hearted folk, and what it really speaks to, I think, is it's triggering people who have seen decades now of income inequality. Those people are being, I think, triggered. They're being pushed into distrusting or hating others. It's a very powerful platform for political movement, but it's not one that is sustainable, and it's not one that represents the good people of these islands.
Thank you, Adam. Useful lessons and very useful reflection. Catherine, if I can come to you then, we've been broadening the conversation out this afternoon from the particular events in Srebrenica, from which we all must learn lessons, and we've been broadening out that a little to talk about the broader political themes and the broader issues that are arising at the moment as people who are seeking refuge or asylum are being treated or mistreated in different countries across the West. Do you think, to broaden it out a little bit more, we see the events in Srebrenica as an expression perhaps of extreme nationalism, but we saw the response to those events as being a strong expression of internationalism, with cooperation between countries in order to establish the institutions that some of the institutions that were necessary to address the problems of the extreme nationalism. Do you think that we will, given the rise of populism in politics in the West, do you think that there are any signs of the will or the determination to continue to establish and to support those kind of institutions in order to resist the effects of extreme nationalism?
Well, as I think Adam said earlier, I mean, the institutions that we have developed, since World War II, in the United Nations, the Council of Europe, the OSCE, the court in Strasbourg. I mean, all of these things, I think, bode well. I mean, if we stick to it, I mean, they're still in their infancy, these international courts. I'm here in The Hague, with these international courts. ICMP is here because we're a rule of law institution. So I think, making sure that these work. I mean, one can be critical of ICTY or its counterpart for Rwanda, or even ICMP, the ICC, which is constantly under the gun. But these institutions must work, and the European Union as well, which was is really a peace agreement. And this is what's sad in many ways in terms of UK politics, but we have to hold on to these multilateral mechanisms and international mechanisms. I mean, we're a small world. We have to maintain a global front. We have to ensure cooperation. I mean, right now, you mentioned Syria. We have a big program in Syria. We have a program regarding Iraq, where we've helped Iraq find the victims of Daesh crimes, the Yazidi populations. We're trying to help Syria now, Syrian families of the missing, because Syria does not have a viable government at the moment, try to find the 100,000 people who have gone missing from the regime of Hafez al-Assad, the current conflict, and those that have now migrated to Europe. We're working in Colombia, where again, 100,000 people went missing from the 50-year conflict, and in Mexico, which is grappling with years of violence, linked to cartels and criminal activity, and the war on drugs, and the world. I think if we keep at it, and I do share Adam's optimism, but we are in a vulnerable place at the moment. We must make sure to preserve multilateralism, to preserve these courts, to build the mechanisms of good governance in the countries where we're working, and to hold the line, to make sure that these governments take responsibility. And I think if we do this and we work with families of the missing or other civil society organizations, they have to learn about what their rights are. When it comes to missing persons, also, the majority who go missing in conflict or human rights abuses or migration are men, which means you largely have women survivors. And they also are marginalized in patriarchal society. So working together with them, again, going back to the theme of cooperation, making sure they come together. And I think this is where, just going back to Srebrenica for a moment, the women of Srebrenica, along with counterparts from the region, have been really one of the big driving forces behind ensuring that the states took responsibility. But as international organizations, we had to be there with them. So I'm a firm believer in these multilateral institutions, but they have to work. We can be cynical. There are moments, I mean, definitely the UN needs to be reformed, but we have to keep at it and we have to keep going.
Thank you, Catherine. And one quick follow-up on that. It crossed my mind that one of the early steps taken by the incoming Biden administration was, for the first time, I think, for any US administration, was to accept the genocide of the Armenian people at the end of the First World War. Do you think that step by the Biden administration is a positive sign in terms of their approach to genocide wherever it happens, and that the Biden administration will take a very different tack and approach in comparison to the previous administration?
Yes, I think so. I think anything's better than previous administration. But yeah, no, I think, and again, the term genocide and how we use it is a highly politicized thing. But it is, and again, in the case of Srebrenica, this is irrefutable evidence, and there are two courts that ruled in favor of the fact that there was genocide. But I think, if I may, one good thing about the Biden administration is in January, Biden put together an interagency task force that consists of the State Department, Homeland Security, and Health and Human Services to reunite the families of the children that are in detention. And we are hoping to help that task force. So to me, that's a positive sign. That's a state taking responsibility, creating the mechanisms of good governance, and reuniting these families, because what happened on the border is a massive human rights violation. And taking responsibility as a state is an important first step. And if I may, in Europe, building the same intergovernmental institutions that are cost effective is a first step in dealing with the large number now of dead and missing migrants. So there are things that can be done, but I think it's not just recognizing genocide. It's taking responsibility today for what is happening in our own countries. And if we don't do this, this will create political instability, which can lead to war.
Thank you, Catherine. Summing up the discussion that we've had on matters relating to the Balkans, to Srebrenica, the commemoration there today, and to the international implications for us all, politically and internationally, you summed that up extremely well there. I'm very grateful to you. Thank you. I'm mindful of the time this afternoon. We've had an extremely in-depth and informative and meaningful and impactful conversation this afternoon, focusing on the events in Srebrenica 26 years ago, but also on the implications for us all and across Europe. We are perhaps unique in media organisations in the UK today not to have spent the whole hour talking about football. So I can only say that indicates again the particular approach that Broadcasting Scotland takes to news, current affairs and culture. And whilst we might have indulged with a brief conversation perhaps about the media coverage of football rather than football itself, and indulging in punditry, I think in the circumstances what we will do is acknowledge that there is a football competition today, acknowledge that it is best when people indulge their nationalism in the context perhaps of organised sport, and international organisations, none of which are perfect, but all of which try to do better, will acknowledge the Euro finals today, but do no more than that. So what I will do, and I won't ask either of you to indulge in football punditry today. So what we will do is firstly say thank you to Catherine Bomberger for joining us from The Hague this afternoon.
It was a pleasure, really. Great show as well. And thank you so much for highlighting. And I have to say, Scotland itself, and remembering Srebrenica Scotland, which we didn't even talk about, is a great organization. And Scotland has done so much to recognize what's happened in Srebrenica. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Catherine. And Adam, thank you to Adam Boyes for joining us also today. And thank you for your input as well, Adam.
Thank you very much, Andrew. It was a great show. Very good in-depth topics too, and great report from Bosnia.
Thank you for joining us. Now, in order to do what we do, which is to take a particular approach to news, current affairs and culture, Broadcasting Scotland does rely upon the support of people. So please, if you wish to assist us in continuing to have these in-depth discussions and to report on news and current affairs and culture in a particular way, then please support Broadcasting Scotland. You can see the web address on the screen now. If you would like to volunteer to assist us, then please also go to the website and you can message us there. I would like to thank everyone for their contributions today, this afternoon, to Adam, to Catherine, to Ika. I should also say happy birthday to Linda, and finishing up this afternoon, it would be wrong not to say Forza Azzurri. So thank you for joining us this afternoon. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.